When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. The art of negotiation has been described as a back and forth of maneuvers and countermaneuvers, a game, if you will, and often chess is used as an analogy for diplomatic talks. However, what happens when it's more of a game of chicken to see how far the parties are willing to go and who blinks first? What happens when you can't trust that the party across the table is reasonable? That's the situation that I'm discussing with my special guest today. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. My guest today, in his recently released book, U.S. Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory, looks at how theorists developed an approach to foreign policy that was then employed by Richard Nixon when he became president and is still relevant to policy crafting in the modern day. James D. Boys is a senior research fellow at University College London's Center on U.S. Politics. He's previously been a visiting scholar at the Center for Strategic Studies at Tufts University's Fletcher School, a visiting senior research fellow at King's College London, and a visiting research fellow at the University of North Dakota, in addition to holding several posts at the American University in London. His academic expertise is combined with direct experience of politics on both sides of the Atlantic, having worked on Capitol Hill and held political office in the United Kingdom. He received his PhD from the University of Birmingham, his master's degree from the Institute of United States Studies, and holds a Bachelor of Arts from Leicester University. As he'll talk more about in our discussion, James has also published 3 books previously on the Clintons. He is currently based in Boston. I'll have a link to his book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, so that you can get a copy of your own once you're done listening to this episode. Speaking of, without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my conversation with James. James, thanks so much for joining us on Presidencies today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, and I had a great time reading your book. It is so insightful. But I thought to get us started, would you mind sharing what got you interested in researching the history of the Madman Theory and its impact on U.S. policy?
Well, my career to date had always been focused upon the Clinton era. My PhD had been on Bill Clinton's first term foreign policy that developed into the first book I wrote. Then that evolved into the second book I wrote, the 2 of which covered Clinton's grand strategy and then the counterterrorism strategy of that administration during its time in office. I was invited then to write a political biography of Hillary Clinton ahead of the 2016 election. So I was perhaps Clintoned out by that point, I think. So there was that level. I was looking for a new challenge. Secondly, when I had been teaching in London, I used to teach a course called Foreign Policy Analysis. And as part of that, one small part of one class, I would talk about the Nixon-Kissinger relationship and discuss the idea that the President of the United States would, on occasion, try to get his Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, depending upon the time we were looking at, to travel around the world and explain to America's adversaries that whilst he, Dr. Kissinger, was a sane and logical individual, he found himself working for a president who was unhinged and was threatening to use nuclear weapons or extreme force if his enemies didn't capitulate, and that this was known as the Madman Theory. Now, I'd always had quite a sort of a relaxed approach in class, and I'm sure some of my students must have thought, oh, I'm just pulling their leg. So I would have to remind them repeatedly, no, 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 I'm not kidding. This is an accepted fact. But what I struggled to do was to find a decent text to relay them to and say, no, go away, read this, and you'll understand that I'm not having a laugh. This is something that really happened. And, there were snippets in this book and snippets in that, but there wasn't anything that I could really point to them and say, right, this is the definitive work. Go and have a look at this. And time passed, and my wife and I moved to the United States in 2019. And shortly thereafter, I was invited by a good friend and colleague to write an article that addressed irrationality in foreign policy. And I thought, oh, here's a great chance to discuss the madman theory with regard to Nixon. And then obviously at that point, we were in the first Trump administration. So I bring it up to date, as I always try to do, to make my research as relevant as possible. So I wrote this paper, and just as I was finishing it, I was thinking, oh, this is really interesting. I'd enjoyed writing it. I really hadn't got a focus for what I wanted to do next. And I thought, well, this paper could be quite easily developed into book number 4. And that's how that idea came about in terms of writing something about it. I was always interested in blending theory with policy development, because I feel that, as an academic, a lot of my colleagues will quite happily write from an intellectual, high-minded, brilliant, often, point of view about policy documents. But that can often be, with the best will in the world to them, quite dry and inaccessible to the general readership. And I've always wanted to take my research beyond the realm of the academy and into the public domain whenever possible. So to me, the way that you do that is that you make policy as relevant as possible to the general public. And the way to do that is to talk about policy initiatives, to talk about how policy is devised, which I always find really interesting, and then how it actually comes about. So you can measure ideas and concepts with stuff that's actually delivered upon. So I was eager to try and structure the book along those lines. I was also seeing from the moment that President Trump was elected in the November through his first months in office and then into the first year, that you'd seen an awful lot of sometimes academics, but more time journalists seeking to find a way to critique an administration that they were fundamentally opposed to. And they were using their understanding of the madman theory to do it. And I call that like the veneer of respectability. We don't want to just look like we're too critical. So we'll take this idea that we understand a little bit about that maybe Nixon had done, who we also didn't like, and we'll apply it to the president. And all of a sudden, Nixon will seem actually quite restrained and respectable. So I saw the way in which the madman theory was being either deliberately or otherwise misunderstood, misaligned, misapplied to an administration. And I thought the book I'd wanted to point my students to had still not been written. So maybe I should write the book. And that's ultimately what I set out to do and have hopefully succeeded.
I love that. And yes, I think that you have succeeded. As I'll tell our listeners, we're going to have a great discussion here, but there's so much more that we're not going to be able to cover and so much more in your book. But like you said, and that's something that I found in studying history over the years, is that sometimes things that it seems so simple, but if you really don't dive into it, you lose some of the nuances. It can be misapplied, and being able to kind of correct the record and really understand what's going on, that's something that I've been dedicated to as well. And I definitely see that in your work.
That's very kind of you. There's one thing to try to do something, and there's, if anybody who writes, I think inevitably writes in isolation. And it's very easy, I think, sometimes to get lost in your own head and think, well, I've done this, and then you put it out to the world, and then the devastating answer is no, you haven't. So you can only do your best and hope that you've delivered upon what you've sought to, and the feedback has been universally positive, and that's very kind of you to say. So I do appreciate that, Jerry. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, and to help us to understand this a bit better, what would ultimately be dubbed the madman theory came about due to the work of 3 academics that you described as the quote-unquote architects of Armageddon: Thomas Schelling, Daniel Ellsberg, and Henry Kissinger. I have no doubt that we'll be talking more about the third as we go along, but I was wondering if you could share a little bit about each of them and how their ideas gave birth to this theory.
I'd be happy to. Can I just first of all just define how I see the madman theory? Because I think we should probably do that, because I think it's one of these ideas that people may still have a misunderstanding about, because I think it is generally misunderstood.
Absolutely.
So my definition of the madman theory is this. It is a tactic deployed as part of a wider strategy whereby a sane leader feigns irrationality in an attempt to convince an adversary of an apparent mad intent, whereby if their will is not delivered upon, they will use excessive, oftentimes military or diplomatic force to get their way. And that's basically it. But that's often been misunderstood, misapplied, and the suggestion of it's a madman applying a mad theory. So that having been said, where does this come about? I always think it's fascinating that the foreign policy tactic, which is most associated with Richard Nixon and now perhaps also with Donald Trump, finds its origins on the university campus of Harvard University. What a remarkable place for this to come about. And they say Americans don't do irony. Well, here we are. We find it begins, I think, ultimately with Thomas Schelling, who has a background in trade negotiations in the 40s and into the 50s. And in the early 1950s, he realizes that his background isn't just applicable to trade negotiation, but also potentially to foreign policy, which is interesting because one of the questions I've often been asked over the last couple of months is, could the madman theory be applied outside of foreign policy? Are there other applications? And of course, it actually begins in many ways in the realm of business and international trade, rather than necessarily in sort of Cold War or military applications. So the answer is yes. So Thomas Schelling is fascinating because he is someone who is widely appreciated, widely recognized, widely awarded and given plenty of plaudits. But what is interesting about him from an academic point of view is that he is someone who, unlike many academics, is very, very happy to talk about the everyday in terms of he's trying to explain his concepts and put them in everyday settings. So if you read his work, which is basically in many ways at the dawn of like the game theory concept, instead of taking these quite high-minded ideas of game theory and putting them in quite sort of like, highfalutin terms, he will make them accessible to the general public and use everyday examples about why and how they're of significance. And eventually his ideas evolve to a point where he's talking about negotiating and how to get the best out of a negotiating position. And he comes with this idea of the strategy of conflict and how it is that you could suspend rationality in a negotiating environment, whereby most people, if they negotiate, will assume that the other person is rational, they'll be rational, and therefore you'll have a rational discussion and come to a rational conclusion. Schelling's idea is, well, if you suspend rationality and appear crazy, that will destabilize the negotiating tactics. It will throw off the other person's approach, because their approach will be based upon the idea that I'm sane, you're sane, we can be sane together, etc., etc. If all of a sudden now you're acting like a madman, then all of a sudden they are destabilized, don't know how to react. And even if that just creates a 1% advantage, then that could be enough to basically tip the balance. So Schelling comes up with this idea of suspended rationality in negotiations. He has a young man at Harvard University who is very much in awe of Schelling. He's his mentor in many ways, and that's Daniel Ellsberg. Now, Daniel Ellsberg is someone who many people listening to this will know, but for not in this context. He, of course, is very famous for the subsequently leaking the Pentagon Papers in the early 1970s. But he has a remarkable tale to tell and a life to lead before that, during that. And it's very difficult to tell the Nixon story without understanding the Ellsberg story. So Ellsberg is someone who was doing a lot of work at Harvard under and with Schelling, and their work is sort of bypassing one another, overlapping one another. There's a lot of overlap between their work, and indeed, an awful lot of what Ellsberg says in many ways is, well, my work is like Schelling, but I've taken it to the next level. There's that classic sort of like, well, I've got to recognize the debt I owe to Schelling, but I need to show how I'm going above and beyond. And was it to quote Hamlet, methinks he doth protest too much a little bit. There's a little bit of that. But credit to Ellsberg. He's out there and he's doing this work. And he gives a public address at Boston Public Library in which he talks about the political use of madness and how it is that political leaders can use madness to scare the bejeebers out of their opponents in a way to get the benefits of a war, but without firing a shot in many ways. Now, this is in the late 1950s. And Ellsberg uses Hitler as an example of this. He'll point to what Adolf Hitler does in the late 1930s when he makes threats of force in an attempt to get the benefits of war, but without actually having to go to war. And he talks about the move into the Sudetenland and into Czechoslovakia, for example, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you get this idea that Ellsberg is using examples from his recent past to talk about how people can be crazy, appear crazy in an attempt to get the benefits of war. Ellsberg and Schelling are doing all this both at Harvard and as well as that they're doing work at the Rand Corporation in California. So we should mention them as well. Somebody who is listening to all this and is aware of the conversation that Ellsberg is doing in particular is another Harvard academic at that point, one Dr. Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger at that point hears Ellsberg's speech and invites him into his classes to deliver that speech effectively to his Harvard academic group. So you've got this sort of confluence of three individuals, Schelling, Ellsberg, and Kissinger. Kissinger has his own background of research. In 1957, he'd put out Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, which was a successful, controversial book, and begins Kissinger's rise from sort of an obscure Harvard academic to the sort of international man of history, traveling the world as America's probably most vaunted diplomat, quite frankly. At the heart of that is the idea that you could have a winnable tactical nuclear war. So these people are not sitting down in any way together. They're not working together necessarily, coming up with, well, what should we call this? Oh, we should call it madman theory. But what they are doing individually and in part sometimes together, part sometimes in conflict, are coming up with ideas about how it is that the United States could embrace the world. Eisenhower's in office at this point. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that policy and how this relates to that. But you have these Cold War strategists out there who are trying to devise policies which could possibly then be implemented by a future administration. And again, that's something which I thought was very interesting. How do these policies come about? How do you then make the leap from, well, it's all right, we can write these things in Harvard Yard, but how do you then make the move down the Bosch-Wash corridor from what Neil Ferguson calls the move from academic to power, effectively? And the way in which Schelling, Ellsberg, and Kissinger all do that, because they all end up working for government at some point in different administrations, in different positions, with devastating impacts for themselves and the country in many ways. That was fascinating to me. And it's something which I try to get across in the book in terms of how it is that these three people's intellectual capacities impact the country and how their attempts to implement it lead to devastating results globally and also for their own interpersonal relationships, which utterly break down.
Well, and like you were saying, this isn't necessarily happening in a vacuum, even though these are theoretical concepts that they're developing. There's still actual policies and administrations at the time as they're developing these theories. And as you get into the history of the madman theory, you also take readers through policy approaches taken by previous administrations, including Harry Truman's containment strategy and Dwight Eisenhower's New Look. So, James, would you mind speaking to the policy strategies of the early Cold War presidents and the impact that they had on crafting what became the madman theory?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, what you've got is a whole host of academics, intellectuals across the country. And it's not just these three people, of course, it's a whole host of people. This just happened to be three of the most prominent, brilliant individuals who come up with this idea that we're talking about today. But there are, of course, many others. It's interesting. We look back from our position here now and we see what looks like an inevitable series of events. But of course, there was nothing inevitable about it. And that's something I think which all students should consider. Nothing is inevitable until it actually happens. when the Cold War begins, and indeed there's great debate about when exactly that is. There's a great question for students. When does the Cold War end and when does it begin? You have in the White House Harry Truman, who, of course, had only been vice president for 12 weeks before he succeeds Franklin Roosevelt. He doesn't know anything about the atomic weapons program that Oppenheimer is developing along with others. His own cabinet who know about it don't even know if he's cleared for it for security, and he's now the president, which is quite remarkable. So you've now got an administration which is coming to power with an untested president who has now got to deal with Joseph Stalin, new leadership in Great Britain, because of course Churchill's left the scene. So the only man left standing from the Cold War, from the war years, is Stalin, which perhaps is not an ideal situation. So now you've got to figure out, well, okay, where does U.S. policy lie? How are we seeing the Soviet Union? Because of course, throughout the Second World War, the Roosevelt administration had been trying to encourage Americans to, become pen pals with Russians and treat them like, oh, they're our friends. This is Uncle Joe. In many ways, having as cozy a relationship with Stalin as he might or might not actually have done with Churchill. What are the Soviet ambitions? There's always questions about where priorities should lie. How are we viewing the Soviet? Are they allies? Are they now adversaries? People forget when Churchill comes to Washington and delivers what becomes known as the Iron Curtain speech, that is not greeted with glee in any ways by the population in the United States or by the press. It's held in horror. What are you doing? This is Churchill going back to his pre-war years. Look, he's just a warmonger. He's talking about, he can't worry about Germany anymore. Now it's a Soviet Union. And of course, it's only a year later on when Truman basically realizes that, actually Churchill was right and comes up with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, et cetera, and starts moving in that direction and embracing the containment policy. That becomes synonymous with those years. So the Democratic administration of Harry Truman comes up with this idea of we'll basically adopt a sphere of influence approach, which is, right, containment. We'll have this zone of the world, you have that zone of the world, and that will be sufficient to basically maintain a cold peace, if you will. The Republican Party, of course, has been out of power it will be 20 years before you get to the next election. So they're itching to come up with ideas, and this is obviously a democracy, so you have to, object to whatever policies are being enacted by the party in power. So the Republican strategists, including people like John Foster Dulles, are coming up with alternatives. And one of the alternatives is what they're calling rollback, which is, right, it's not enough to have a sphere of influence because that's accepting Russian aggression to retain its place in Central and Eastern Europe. What's the point of fighting for the freedom of Poland if all we've done is replace the German occupation with a Russian occupation? So the Republicans' policy effectively in a nutshell is, right, well, we should not accept what the Russians have gained through oppression. We should seek to push them back. And this idea of rollback. So I've raised, therefore, John Foster Dulles, who was an important voice in the years leading up to Eisenhower's election in 1952, clearly trying to establish himself as someone who might be considered for a senior role in that administration, which of course he gets. Now, of course, once they become the administration and they move into office, they realize that it's not as simple as that. That if you're going to talk about rollback, what that means is we've got to physically remove the Red Army from what is now at that point East Germany and all those nations behind what Churchill referred to as the Iron Curtain, and push them back seemingly into the Soviet Union. That is no easy task. How are you going to do that? Are we now going to have a land war in Europe? Well, nobody wants that. Are we going to use nuclear weapons? Nobody wants that. Eisenhower obviously also inherits the Korean conflict, which he doesn't want either. So you have a remarkable situation whereby America's oldest president at that point, Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the most decorated, respected military leaders of his generation, someone who had overseen the D-Day landings, someone who'd been the supreme Allied commander of European forces, someone who probably knew more about military tactics and deployment and the reality of war than anybody who'd sat in the Oval Office at that point, certainly, and maybe even since. He's now having to figure out how on earth to wage a new kind of war, a Cold War, against an adversary that nobody quite knew what they would do, how they would do it, what their military capabilities were. Were they exaggerated? Were they underestimated? In the full knowledge that if they got it wrong, it would be the last mistake they possibly made. And so what you saw happen with Eisenhower when he comes in is he tries to move away from many of the approaches that Truman had adopted, which were becoming increasingly expensive. And Eisenhower's approach was, we simply cannot afford to go on like this. It will either bankrupt us or we'll end up in nuclear war. So he tries to move away from a focus upon having a large manned army to a one whereby we will have a greater focus upon a nuclear deterrent. The problem with that is, of course, is that if you follow that to its natural conclusion, what that means is that you present the president with only one of two choices, which is either in a crisis, you either do nothing or you go nuclear. And that is no kind of choice whatsoever. And again, you get this is the United States, and you often see this, you get this pendulum effect between administrations. And a policy will last for 8 years, it will come in, it'll be replaced for 8 years, and then 8 years later on, there'll be a sense of, oh, well, what they were doing 8 years ago wasn't so bad, we should go back to that. And sure enough, when Kennedy succeeds Eisenhower, he will talk about having a flexible response to get away from this idea that only one or two options exist. So you are seeing this pendulum effect during the Cold War of how we should adopt new policy, what should those policies be, how should they be enacted, and what Kissinger and Schelling and Ellsberg have attempted to do during their time at Harvard is to come up with new policies which are seen as being potentially adoptable to give a president a new range of options that he could potentially implement during a very, very dangerous Cold War environment.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting that you bring up this idea of a pendulum and how things change with these election cycles and new administrations coming in, because you talk about in your book that in the 1964 election, the campaign against Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater had made a concerted effort of painting him as a madman. And so I was wondering, did you find in your research that something changed between the point of Goldwater's failed candidacy and then when Nixon embraced the madman theory after taking office in 1969, or did Nixon's embrace of the theory come as a surprise?
Well, I'm really glad you asked me about this chapter, because one of the wonderful things about doing conversations like this is it gives me the chance to talk about, and listeners and hopefully readers a chance to understand about how a project evolves. That chapter was not in the book as I'd originally devised it. I was going to jump from talking about Nixon as VP to Nixon as president. And as I was doing so, I thought, well, that's fine, but that's an 8-year gap. Well, what's happening in those 8 years? And the answer is a hell of a lot. As anybody who lived through that time period or understands that time period in the United States, crikey, more happens in an 8-year time period than in decades in many other countries. And I was trying to understand, I'd studied that period. I was always interested in it. In fact, it was my initial interest in the Kennedy administration that got me interested in American politics in the first place. So I was interested to write about that. And I was trying to think, well, what's the connection? And the connection is madness. And what I try to do at the beginning of the book is talk about the kind of mental health issues, that if we can use that term, that might have affected previous leaders that proponents of the madman might seek to replicate to convince an adversary that they have, lost their mind or that they are suffering. And I thought, well, okay. The United States between 1961, when Nixon leaves the White House as vice president, and then when he returns in January 1969 after the 68 election, so much has occurred, so much tumult. People talk about the 1960s like, oh, it's a wonderful time. And it was in many ways, but my goodness, there were some horrendous things happening, both in the United Kingdom, but particularly here in the United States. So I thought, well, okay, here's a chance to link Nixon as VP to Nixon as president. How on earth does he make that return? Because there's an idea that there are no second acts in American politics. And Nixon is one of the very few exceptions. But how do you get from having lost that election to Jack Kennedy to now coming back in January of 69? So what I wanted to talk about was the idea that there was not only is there potential madness at the heart of the madman theory, but that there is a madness across the land that is howling and is devouring everything in front of it, and that the best and the brightest, to quote Halberstam, are being lost, and you are being left with whoever is standing, effectively, in many ways. And that is Richard Nixon, ultimately. He's the great survivor. And so I wanted to talk about how it is that Kennedy had come in trying to repudiate everything that Nixon and Eisenhower had talked about during their 8 years in office, only to find themselves presented with the most dangerous era in the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, whereby you have an opponent, Nikita Khrushchev, who appears to be using the madman theory himself. Again, we look back and we know that the Cuban Missile Crisis resolved itself, but it didn't have to. It could easily have become a very, very different conclusion. And at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the White House receives 2 letters. One initially saying, yes, okay, we can go along with this. And then almost like, the very next morning, they get a much more hardline approach in which the White House isn't sure whether Khrushchev has been overthrown. Has he lost his mind? What's going on here? And indeed, when we talk about the madman theory and the influence that Nixon has for embracing it, yes, we can talk about John Foster Dulles and his experience under Eisenhower, but Nixon himself will say, my influences were not just Dulles. It was seeing how Khrushchev played the game and scared the hell out of people. He will talk about his conversations with Syngman Rhee and about how it is that he, in South Korea, will attempt to sort of leverage against North Korea, for example. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you're suddenly faced with an administration who realizes that the Soviet leader is threatening, potentially taking the world to the brink of nuclear war over, Cuba, just some 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So they are now having to recognize the ramifications of the madman theory. And then less than a year, just over a year after that, with the assassination of President Kennedy, the idea that changes everything, and the Pandora's box, effectively, which is opened with that singular event, and how that has a ripple effect through the decade. People forget or don't know one of the reasons that President Kennedy was in Dallas was not just a singular trip. It was an attempt to do a multi-city tour around Texas. It was in many ways, it was the first trip of the 1964 campaign for re-election. And that was expected to be waged against Barry Goldwater, a Republican senator from Arizona, with whom John F. Kennedy had a great relationship. It might sound ridiculous, but there was a day and an age in which political leaders did not sort of seemingly hate one another, eviscerate one another. They had disagreements with one another, but there had been talks. Maybe this gets blown out of proportion because of sentimental reasons, because of what would ultimately happen or not happen. But the two men supposedly had talks about traveling around the country and having debates between themselves about the future direction of the country in a like which we've never seen, and which students of history might think back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, for example. Now, that never came about because of the assassination. And one of the interesting things is the way in which Goldwater laments what has happened to his friend John F. Kennedy, not only because of the national tragedy or the personal tragedy, but for the reason that he recognizes that, and I think I'm quoting him here, the idea of a Goldwater presidency died with John F. Kennedy's assassination. There was no way on earth that the party were going to shift, the country was going to elect a Republican president in the aftermath of this. But he also realized that if he ran, he'd be facing Lyndon Johnson. And he wasn't known as Lying Lyndon without a good reason. This is someone whose reputation in Texas had been, very, very, very problematic. Goldwater had no time for him, and he realized it would be a dirty campaign, and he was right. And he considered not running, but did so ultimately. And the way that he was dealt with in that campaign, I think, actually becomes a blueprint for future, campaigns. If you look back, as historians, you're always looking for turning points and demarcation points. And whilst there has always been name calling and dirty politics in politics throughout history, if you look at the 64 campaign, the way in which you now eviscerate a candidate, especially on the right, by basically saying, okay, well, this Republican candidate is deranged. He is too enraptured with the idea of having the nuclear arsenal at his disposal. He will take us to the brink of nuclear war. And he is crazy. It leads to the most famous political advert in probably US history, the Daisy commercial, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, where a young girl is picking the daisies off the petals off a daisy, and all of a sudden you end up with a nuclear bomb. And as Barry Goldwater himself said, well, the conclusions were clear: elect Barry Goldwater, and you'll basically blow up the world. So the way in which Goldwater campaigns is seen by Nixon as the way not to do things. Nixon obviously had campaigned in 60 and had done so in a very forthright fashion. He's a very serious individual. He's someone who always seems so much older than John F. Kennedy. And of course, he wasn't. They were of the same political generation. There was a lovely quote I heard. Nixon looked like an older person's idea of what a young man should look like, which I always thought was brilliant. And,
that's very descriptive.
It's spot on, actually. And you see it if you also think about it. If you look at that campaign in 60, when both Kennedy and Nixon were they'd been veterans of the Second World War. They'd both been in the Pacific. They'd both been in the Navy. But Nixon, when he campaigns, puts his studio picture out of him in his dress blues with his hat on, very serious, stoic, and high-minded. And the Kennedy campaign basically put out a picture of him, when he's commanding PT 109, he's stripped to the waist, he's got his Ray-Bans on, he's capped at a jaunty angle, and he looks like a young guy who would have done actually in the heat of battle, effectively. And that was always a lovely image to distinguish between the two of them. But what you see Goldwater do 4 years later on is assiduously try and say, look, I should put a choice before the American people, not an echo. I'm not going to sit here and say, yes, I'm going to carry on doing what Kennedy did, because even Johnson wasn't. Johnson was talking already about the Great Society and looking not to Kennedy, but to FDR as a role model about what he would want to do should he get his own term in office, which, of course, he moves to do. And Goldwater at that point makes the classic mistake. If anybody's out there looking to run for office out there, here's my advice to you kids. Don't tell the truth. The truth will not win you an election. Hide what you really want to do until you have taken the oath of office, and then do whatever you want to do, and then say, oh, well, I wanted to do this, but I couldn't do it. But blame circumstances. Goldwater makes the mistake of being honest about the state of the world, what's going on, how crooked Lyndon Johnson is, and that the American people are being lied to. Because Goldwater says, we are at war in Vietnam. You can say whatever you like. Jack Kennedy put 16,000 military advisors in. Johnson is just waiting until he has been sworn in under McNamara, and you will see ground troops going in. And of course, Johnson says, oh, no, that's terrible. That's an outright lie. We're not doing that at all. And 12 weeks? Johnson is elected in November 64. He's inaugurated in his own term in office in January 65. And in March, 12 weeks later, the first troops are being deployed to Da Nang. Goldwater wasn't wrong, which in that sense entirely. He's also talking about how it is that NATO should be allowed to defend itself if a nuclear war breaks out. And he says, listen, NATO, and this is a really interesting argument considering where we are today in the debate about NATO, for example. NATO is not going to hold together if it just looks like European nations are beholden totally to an American commander-in-chief in terms of, well, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we do this? How, if push comes to shove, these nations have to be able to defend themselves. And Goldwater's argument is that should include the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Now, editorial comment goes ballistic at this point. Johnson goes ballistic. So this is outrageous. This is terrible. You're talking about basically farming this out so that any local commander in NATO could use nuclear weapons. And on the surface, that does sound terrible. Unfortunately, what Goldwater was saying was already standard operating procedure. Kennedy didn't know this. When Kennedy becomes president in January 61, he says, well, we should draw in control of this. And he's told that under operating principles that had been in place under Eisenhower, which remained in place under Kennedy and then under Johnson, if in the final analysis, local commanders did have control over local weapons if the White House could not be reached. So what Johnson was saying was simply not true. And what Goldwater was saying was just what was actually happening. And as he said, if I can be called mad for suggesting a policy which is already in place, what do we call a president who's denying its very existence? So this idea of madness, and there are other examples that the Goldwater campaign embrace, are seen as disqualifying identities for an American president. So when Nixon looks at this, he's aghast and thinks, well, okay, if when I run again, this is what not to do. And sure enough, the idea, of course, that Nixon's reputation is for one of dishonesty in many circles. And I think you can look back at what happens in the 64 election as being a guiding principle to Nixon to say, well, okay, this is how not to win an election. If and when I run in 4 years, I need to do the opposite of this. And sure enough, that's what he does. He basically, paths everything back, talks very cautiously, doesn't get cute by paraphrasing Cicero in his acceptance speech, talking about, extremism in the defense of virtue being no vice, for example. He presents himself very much in 68 as a new Nixon, as someone who has very much learnt from history. And one of the historic lessons he has learnt is do not campaign like Barry Goldwater.
Absolutely. And it works. That strategy works for him. He gets to the White House as president. And as you describe in your work, James, Richard Nixon took this idea of the madman theory and ran with it.
Mm-hmm.
You note that his faith in this approach stemmed from, quote, his belief that only he could pull this off. So could you share with us how the madman theory shaped the Nixon administration's approach to foreign policy and how their approach deviated from the trajectory that previous Cold War presidents had taken?
Yeah, so one of the things that I try to get across is that you can't just wake up one morning and convince the world that you're going to adopt the madman theory. You have to have established what I call the credible threat. So throughout the book, I talk about various presidents, leaders, and how they've established a credible threat. And Nixon believes that his credible threat stems from his 8 years as vice president, his career before that as a virulent anti-communist, and the extent to which he is hated in many circles in this country on the left in a way that is rarely seen. Certainly back then, Nixon was the bête noire of liberals, and he utilized that, I think, as a way in which he could say, yes, I am the Prince of Darkness, effectively, and I will play to your darkest fears in many ways. We see some of the ways in which he uses what could be seen as underhand tactics during the 1968 campaign to secure the nomination and then the presidency, which I invite readers to have a look at and see quite the depths of skullduggery that he is seen to plumb during that time period. But the madman theory takes hold almost immediately. One of his very first acts is to appoint Dr. Kissinger as his national security advisor. Now, this, of course, is remarkable because there is no relationship between Nixon and Kissinger. In fact, Kissinger is working for Nixon's main opponent going into that election cycle. And as a result of that, one of the great debates about, well, where does the madman theory come from? And you see this in the years in the 1970s and 80s, various academics, historians are trying to blame either Nixon or Kissinger for the very idea of the madman theory. And indeed, you have very individuals, Seymour Hersh, for example, trying to say, it's actually, this is a Kissinger idea. Joan Hoff, for example, tries to say, so this has nothing to do with Nixon, this is all Kissinger, pushing this horrible idea away from the president and towards Dr. Kissinger. But of course, Nixon first mentions the idea, apparently the madman theory, in about August 1968 to H.R. Haldeman, a long time before Kissinger comes to work for his eventual administration. So the origins of this are interesting. However, what is even more so is the way in which almost as soon as Nixon and Kissinger are working together in the White House, they come together and start putting together the building blocks for what will become the madman theory, ostensibly in Cambodia, in Laos, and in Vietnam, on the simple basis that they see what Johnson and McNamara have been trying to do for the past 4 or 5 years, and it hasn't worked. So what do we do? How do we, as a new administration, come to a new route to success in Southeast Asia? What do we do that Johnson and McNamara hadn't done? How do we go about doing this? And increase political violence and militarism is the decision that they decide to take. Ultimately, they believe that Johnson and McNamara are not doing enough. So we need to go for more high altitude bombing, for example. We need to expand the war ultimately in a secretive fashion into Cambodia, into Laos. We need to be talking about taking out infrastructure in Vietnam. And again, I hope that people who are listening to this and reading this will suddenly start to realize, oh, this sounds familiar, because what President Trump has talked about doing in Iran, oh, no, this is the week we'll be taking out the infrastructure. There are so many interesting parallels between this administration and Nixon, which is, again, is another reason I was interested in putting this book out at this time. So what you see Nixon and Kissinger doing is, and this is what is fascinating about this, is when Nixon moves into the White House, there is a taping system in place, which he's inherited from Johnson, which he rips out. I would suggest that if he had kept to that approach, he would have seen out his time in office and would never have had to resign the office. But instead, he decides at a future date to reinstall a far more wide-ranging taping system, which, unlike that adopted by Johnson and Kennedy, had been sort of automated, and you would have to hit a switch or ask someone to make a conscious decision to record something. This system that Nixon gets, because he recognizes he's quite physically ill-adroit and not particularly tech-savvy, it becomes voice-activated. So it records everything indiscriminately. So, of course, that's great as historians, because we now get to hear and read transcripts of Nixon and Kissinger talking in the Oval Office about exactly what it is that we're talking about today, about how it is that Nixon can send Kissinger around the world, threaten these people. I'll say this, Mr. President. That's a great idea, Henry. Well, you could egg on that and do this and say this, and you convince him of this, that, and the other. They are literally game playing, how it is that, and what Kissinger will say to the Russian leadership, to the Vietnamese leadership, to convince them that Nixon is mad enough to do the very, very worst and potentially go use nuclear weapons, destroy massive infrastructure plants, which could have had a far more devastating impact in some cases than actually using tactical nuclear weapons. So this isn't sort of speculation. This is actually now, thanks to the work of other historians, they've drawn this out. We can read about it, and it's all there effectively. One of the interesting things to consider about the madman theory, therefore, is the extent to which, well, A, does it work under Nixon? Maybe, maybe not. But the extent to which it is also part of his downfall. Because without the madman theory, do you even have an impeachment of the president? Well, maybe, but it's important to recognize that one of the articles of impeachment that is utilized against Nixon when they are drawn up is the move into Cambodia, on the basis that that was not sanctioned by Congress. And the move into Cambodia was part of, guess what, the madman theory. So that's of significance. The role that Ellsberg plays in all this is interesting, because he had been brought in during the 68-69 transition by Kissinger to work at the Nixon transition headquarters at the Hotel Pierre in Manhattan to devise, guess what, the Nixon administration's approach to Vietnam. So for all of Ellsberg's protestations later on about how terrible it is that what Nixon's doing, Ellsberg is at the beginning of it, helping to devise what that strategy should be. Now, he obviously goes against it eventually, but he is an architect of the Vietnam War at the very, very beginning. And then when he leaks those documents, the whole rationale for impeaching Nixon is that, he and his plumbers teams have gone into various locations and burglarized and broken into buildings. Everybody thinks about the Watergate building itself, but one of, if not the very first attempt to break into a property was Ellsberg's psychiatrists trying to get incriminating material to show that Ellsberg, who just leaked the Pentagon Papers, was deranged and they could try and destroy him in public. So, the link between the madman theory and Nixon's removal from office, I think, is very clear. So nobody should read my book and think this is a cheerleading session for Nixon and Trump. In many ways, it's a warning sign from history about if you embrace this, that's fine. But the tipping point between the madman and the madman theory is a very fine one to walk. And you have to be very, very careful, because what Nixon does in embracing this and the people he brings in, ultimately, I think, leads to his eventual removal from office.
Well, and I think that's one thing that's very important with your work is that you do talk about the impact that this has. You talk about the three architects of Armageddon and how it impacted them, but also with the administrations, with history. And one question that came up for me as I was reading your book, James, what role do you feel that Nixon's application of the madman theory played in the erosion of public confidence in the American president in particular and the U.S. government in general in the latter decades of the 20th century and on to the present day?
Well, that's a big question, but that's good. Well, when I was originally thinking about this, my initial response would have been none, because the madman theory was kept secret from the American people. One of the issues with the madman theory is that you do not say, my fellow Americans, today I'm embracing the madman theory in an attempt to secure peace in Southeast Asia. Because
that really would be mad.
That really would be mad. And it would also undermine the very idea that for this to work, you have to be seen as feigning it for it to work. And you can't suddenly announce that you're doing it. So this isn't something that most people would be familiar with. People have become more familiar with it, arguably, I think, since Donald Trump became president, for the reasons I discussed at the top of our conversation, which is that, several academics and journalists suddenly sort of stumbled upon this and thought, oh, this is a great way we could attack Donald Trump by, comparing him to Tricky Dick. That's going to be popular with our readers in this publication or whatever. But the nuance of it and the reality of it is something which many people, I think, are still perhaps unfamiliar with. And so at the time, this wasn't something which I think would have made its way into the public domain. However, even if the people didn't know about the madman theory itself, what they did see were the ramifications of it and the contradictions, therefore, that it created between public statements and private acts, between what it was that a president said and what a president did. Because I think what you see is a recognition that administration after administration is, at the very best, misleading the public, and at worst, outright lying. Now, the only question, of course, is where does this begin? Because it would be naive and politically foolish to say this all begins with Nixon. In fact, Nixon's whole argument during the impeachment is, what are we doing? I'm not doing anything that my predecessors didn't do. If you were going to attack me for bugging, well, crikey, Johnson bugged, Nixon, Kennedy bugged. What are we talking about here? Other presidents have done far worse things. Look at me. Look how I love my wife. Every other president had a mistress. I wouldn't dream of doing that to the first lady. I'm an honorable person. And the incredulity that Richard Nixon finds himself is this is a guy who knows all these players. He has been in Congress since, the 46th election. He has served as America's second youngest vice president. Until Kennedy comes along and narrowly beats him, it's Nixon who is the dynamic, meteor in American political life, moving from, what was a lieutenant in the Navy when he was demobbed to becoming vice president in 52. It's like, that's like 6 years. There's a wonderful episode of Mad Men, if anybody ever saw that. I think it's the first season of Mad Men, when Don Draper's company are actually doing campaign work for the Nixon campaign. And it's all very stoic, and they can't believe how frivolous the Kennedy campaign is. And Don Draper is like, I don't see an everyman in John F. Kennedy. I see a silver spoon. With Nixon, I see myself, an everyday man who's made it right to the very, very, very top. So there has always been, I think, hypocrisy and lies and deceit in politics ever since the first person ran for office, I'm sure. But what you see, I think, in the latter half and the mid part of the 20th century, especially in retrospect, is the extent to which administration after administration is guilty of some malfeasance or another, which, if they were known about, would potentially lead to possible impeachment, almost whoever it is. And I think impeachment risks becoming overused. I think the way in which the Constitution was drafted, it was clearly meant to be reserved for high crimes and misdemeanors. But the problem is that very term itself becomes open to speculation. Well, what is a high crime? What is a misdemeanor? We obviously saw this borne out in the late 90s with Bill Clinton, someone whose presidency I took a lot of interest in and spent time writing about. So I think that altogether, when you look at what happens, you have the public disillusionment and heartache, if you will, with the assassination of President Kennedy. You have the coming to power of Lyndon Johnson and the move into Vietnam, effectively, seemingly without much public debate, and hiding from the population about what is actually going on in Vietnam. You have the other assassinations during the 60s of Senator Kennedy, of Malcolm X, of Medgar Evers, etc. You have Richard Nixon coming to power and the crimes of Watergate and what's going on in Southeast Asia. And those, I think that combination of events, I talked earlier on about the madness in the air in the 1960s. Those events that I've just mentioned encapsulate, I think, some of the issues which turn off many Americans to what it is that's going on in the American political sphere, to a point where I think they think, well, there really is a disconnect between what we're being told and what is happening, between what a president says and what a president does. And whilst the madman theory was not public knowledge at that point, it is, I think, indicative of the disconnect between what a president says he might do in office in public and what he will do in private, and the very clear disconnect between the two. And I hope that addresses some of the question.
It does, absolutely. And to your point, the relevance to the present day is apparent, and it speaks to why this is an important work to engage with currently. Because also, as you discuss in your work and you talked about earlier, the madman theory is a strategy that is actively employed by the current U.S. president, but in ways possibly far beyond what those who originated the concept would likely have imagined. Like you said, this isn't just a strategy that can be employed towards foreign policy. And so, James, as we wrap up our conversation, I had to ask whether you envision the madman theory continuing to be turned to by future administrations and leaders, or do you feel that its application may have run its course?
Well, never say never. I think prior to the 2016 election, the madman theory was something which was pretty much solely reserved for consideration of the Nixon presidency, for the reasons that we spent this past hour or so talking about. Clearly, however, that is no longer the case. And as the cover of my book, reveals, hopefully in a nicely graphic capacity, there is this duality now between Nixon and President Trump. But that is no accident. When you look at the time that has elapsed, enough time has elapsed between the Trump presidency and the Nixon presidency for a reappraisal of Richard Nixon. And I think it's fascinating this summer of 2026, there has been something of a renaissance in the Nixon presidency as almost not quite a celebration of it, but certainly a conservative reappraisal. He was always seen as someone who was like, we shouldn't really talk about Richard Nixon. But now I think there's a recognition that we are beyond that. And it's interesting, actually, at his funeral, President Clinton said, the days of judging Richard Nixon by the crimes of Watergate should now be beyond us. We should be able to have a more broad discussion of his life. That was, 1994. So we're now talking 32 years later on. Don't know where those time has gone. But this idea that you can have a reappraisal of Nixon and his policies, and it coincides with a president who, of course, utilized many of these ideas that we're talking about today in the real estate world of Manhattan, perhaps the most cutthroat industry in the United States at that point, and very dangerous environment to work and very high-risk environment. And what you see Donald Trump doing, I think, he's taking the lessons that he learned from people like Roy Cohen, it must be said, from his time as a real estate developer in Manhattan, and applying them to the world stage. And he does so in a way that adheres to his admiration for Richard Nixon. If you look back and you look at what he has said and done, which I think far too few people actually do. I think, again, one of the fascinating things about writing this book was it presented me an opportunity to do a real proper deep dive into the mind of both Richard Nixon and I think more importantly, actually, Donald Trump. I think far too people who do write about the current administration do so at a superficial level, and they don't take the time to actually do the work and go back and say, well, what has this gentleman said and done other than, you're fired, the whole apprentice thing. And, he had a cameo in the second Home Alone film. Well, that's the basis for my paper. That's not enough. You have to take this administration seriously, even if you vigorously disagree with it. And I think that the challenge that far too many people fail to embrace, be they historians, academic, journalists, is that to try to present an image, an impression, a portrait of an administration, even if you fundamentally disagree with it, you have to take it seriously. You have to do the work, and you have to dive down and spend, in some cases, months, years doing the work. What have they said? And then present what these people have said to a readership and say, look, this is the reality. This isn't just, I don't like this person, so I will write trash talk about them. This is what they've said. And if you do that with Donald Trump, what you find is that much like Ronald Reagan did before him, he basically is someone who has spent his life adhering to a small number of closely held beliefs, an admiration for a small number of people, and he's adopting that in office. And people who seem surprised by what he is doing are simply those who have not spent any time analyzing what he has said and done previously, because all right, the past is prologue. If you want to understand the present, look at the past. Donald Trump has long talked about his admiration for Richard Nixon. There you go. Okay, that's no great secret. So he talks about his admiration for Nixon, the strongman approach that he sees in Nixon, that Nixon himself admired in Khrushchev, in Eisenhower, in Sigmund Rhee, in John Foster Dulles. This shouldn't come as a surprise that this is how he might embrace his presidency. Then when you look at what it is that Donald Trump seeks to do, what has he always said? He has always said, and he said this repeatedly in speeches and in writings and in the books that he's published, that he believes that the United States has been routinely ripped off by friend and foe alike around the world, that the American diplomatic corps have negotiated poorly, and that various nations, including North Korea and Iran, have posed an existential threat to the United States. Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise that when he is president and commander-in-chief, he wants to address that. He talked about his issues with Barack Obama and how Obama, he believed, telegraphed policy. We're going to come in next Tuesday and we're going to bomb this building. Well, it just gives your opponents a chance to get out of there. I spoke a little earlier about how the Mad Men show addresses the Nixon presidency. Well, again, trying to adopt a Schelling-esque approach of putting this into the public domain in a way which some people might be familiar with. In the very first season of The West Wing, there was a wonderful episode in which Jed Bartlett is faced with his first overseas capacity to use military force, and he talks about a disproportionate response, and he's eventually talked out of it. But in that moment, Aaron Sorkin is presenting with the viewers with a direct line into the idea of what the madman theory is really about. You take quite a liberal president in the form of Jed Bartlett, who gets mad at an event and he wants to basically, blow his opponents off the face of the earth. And he could do it, but he's talked out of it because that's not what the American way is effectively. So when you see what it is that's happening in this administration, and again, this book should not be seen as a cheerleading exercise for Nixon and Trump, but it doesn't seek to demonize nor lionize. It's trying to talk about a very interesting idea, the madman theory, which I believe has been poorly explained to the American people and to the world at large, misapplied, explain what that is, where it has come from, how it was utilized potentially by Richard Nixon, and how it is that this current administration appears to be utilizing it in its own way in various places around the world, but in a way in which Nixon would never have dreamt of doing so. He certainly wouldn't have used it against America's allies, as clearly Donald Trump has done with regard to NATO in trying to get a greater contribution financially from America's European allies to pay, heaven forbid, for their own defense. And the way in which Donald Trump has done so very, very openly. What Nixon did selectively and in secret, Donald Trump now does routinely and in public. And so we can see both what the madman theory is, how it's been applied in the past, and contrast that with how it's being utilized now. It would be foolish, I think, to suggest that no president in the future would look back and say, well, there were successes in this. And we can see how Donald Trump has used this successfully in the first term and in part in the second term. Whilst recognizing that we might have great disagreements with him on various levels, it would be wrong to say that his use of the madman theory has not arguably been more successful than that of Richard Nixon. And so I think that in the future, at some point, it may be several decades from now, probably another Republican president will look back and say, Donald Trump wasn't all wrong and neither was Richard Nixon. And how we utilize this might have some significance for some future administration in terms of how they seek to address the rest of the world. And perhaps at that point, they might pull out US grand strategy and the madman theory, dust it off the shelf and say, what was that British academic saying and how should we utilize this as a blueprint for future actions?
Well, and now the book is out there, so you can,
and anyway,
they can turn to it. Your students, everybody can. And I do recommend to our listeners, because James, the insights that you provided in this conversation highlight, and there are so many more in the book that we didn't get to, but it highlights the insight that you bring to this fascinating, and as you said, it is something that we are dealing with currently and that probably will in the future. So helping us to understand the past, the present, and where we're going, the insights that you bring are pivotal, and I cannot recommend it enough to our listeners. The book is U.S. Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory from Nixon to Trump. James, thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies today. I cannot thank you enough for your time and all the information that you provided, all the insights, perspective. This was a fascinating conversation.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. I had a wonderful time and I very much appreciate the kind invitation, Jerry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again to James D. Boyce for joining me for this episode. As you can imagine, there is so much more in James's book that we did not get a chance to discuss in our conversation. So be sure to check out U.S. Grand Strategy and the Madman Theory from Nixon to Trump in order to learn more. I'll have a link to the book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidencies Podcast. The sustaining support of folks through Patreon and Substack ensures that I have the equipment and resources needed to produce and grow this podcast. And I cannot thank all of those supporters enough. If you'd like to contribute for as little as $1 per month, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up there. Patrons of the podcast get access to an ad-free feed, which includes special patron-exclusive episodes. For the other sustaining option, if you haven't checked out the monthly newsletter yet, you can go to presidencies.substack.com to check out what's available for free, but I also have some special posts for paid subscribers if you'd like to sign up and contribute that way. If you're not able to contribute on an ongoing basis, but would still like to support the work of the Presidencies Podcast, there are other ways to provide support. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, YouTube, or anywhere else with that capability. Thanks so much to all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidencies Podcast. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.